Yes, I'm Charles Finch. I hail from the Atlanta metropolitan area in Georgia, specifically from Decatur, Georgia. I have written a book entitled Echoes of the Old Darkland, Themes from the African Eden, first published in 1991. In that book, I attempt to do several things, but one of the things I attempt to do is to examine carefully and closely the symbols, the mythology, and religious thinking of Africa from deep antiquity, indeed from prehistory, and see how those myths, those symbols, that religious thinking literally made its way up the Nile or down to the Nile, and through the prism of Nile Valley cultures, eventually ramified into Judeo-Christian religious tradition. But in order to establish that, or in order to get an insight into that, it is necessary and important to establish what you might consider the geo-ethnic background of the lands where the drama of the Bible takes place. Now, where you begin is a little arbitrary, but we can begin about 10,000 years ago or 10 to 12,000 years ago in the lands called the Middle East or the Near East or Western Asia. Now, that is actually a misnomer, because what we call the Middle East, what we call the Near East, what we call Western Asia, really represents Africa's northeast extension. Geologically and geographically, that is exactly what it is. And therefore, when you consider that all humanity begins in Africa as a consequence of a 4 million year gestational period in East Africa, finally culminating in the appearance of Homo sapiens sapiens, that is modern human beings, in Africa about 300,000 years ago, and that when Homo sapiens sapiens, that is modern human beings, began to leave Africa, they had one main corridor. Well, they had other corridors, but the main one was through their northeast extension, through the Isthmus of Suez, into what we now call the Near East. So therefore, the first non-African human beings that you find are indeed in that arena, in what we now think of as Syria and Israel, because African human beings go back as far as 300,000 years ago. Non-African human beings, when you first find them, you find them about 95,000 years ago. And again, where is that? That is in the lands we call the Near East or the Middle East, the lands later on to become the Bible. And indeed, the rest of the world is populated out of Africa. And so that people of African descent represent the aboriginal populations of every inhabitable continent on the globe. Well, we can fast forward, about 80,000 years to about 10,000 or 12,000 BC. Because this African population wave still dominates, you might say, that region of the globe, which includes Africa continentally speaking, but also what I am calling its northeast extension, the so-called land of the Middle East. Because we have, from what we might consider anthropological evidence, people that lived back at that time, between 10 and 12,000 years ago, that are today called the Natufians. Now, when you look at the skeletal characteristics of these people we call the Natufians, they have a combination of their skull, which gives them a long-headed look, combined with a prominence of the lower jaw. There are scientific names for that. We call it dolichocephaly for long-headedness, subnasal prognathism for prominence of the lower jaw. When you see those two characteristics together, you have about 99.9% assurance that you're dealing with an African type, particularly an East African type. What does that mean? That means the 10 to 12,000 years ago, the lands that later became the lands of the Bible, by definition, were inhabited by a completely African population. That was the state of things until about 6,000 years ago, when populations that began to emigrate into the region from the further north, Indo-European populations, began to intermix with these indigenous African or Africoid populations, creating what today is referred to a kind of mulatto, quote unquote, subpopulation, so that by the dawn of history, about 6,000 years ago, when you look at the lands called Canaan, now called Syria, Palestine, the Middle East, you are looking at a population that was fundamentally, quote, mulatto, with pockets of unmixed African or black types there. Now, this is important because when we start considering the Bible, it means that literally the complexion, you might say, of the actors and actresses in the Bible later on changes for us very dramatically. And that, of course, changes our whole perception of the Bible, or the Old Testament in particular, which derives from the Hebrew Torah. Now, for the genealogy of Noah, we find that this is consistent. Now, Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Japheth, and Shem. These represent, Ham, Japheth, and Shem represent the founding ancestors of the 3 major ethnic groups that the Bible recognizes. Ham, which derives, by the way, from the African language of Kemet, Ham, or Ham, means black or blackness, which is the reason why Ham in the Old Testament represents the ancestor of all black and African peoples. Who are his children? Who are his sons? Well, there is Mizra or Mizraim, which is Egypt or Kemet. There is Cush, which is Ethiopia. There is Phut, which some say is Phoenicia. And there is Canaan. And in Canaan, as I say, represents that extension of Northeast Africa. So here we have in the genealogy of the Old Testament itself, Canaan representing a completely African type. So again, what this does is change our conception, you might say, of the what I call our geo-ethnic conception of the lands of the Bible. Now we can again jump forward to about 2,000 years later, really about 4,000 years later, to 2,000 years later to the time of Abraham, about 2000 BC. And by the way, before I even get to that, we find that the archaeological evidence substantiate what we have just said. Jericho, around the city of Jericho, excavations have revealed skulls, which again give us a long-headed type with a prominence of the lower jaw and prominent cheekbones, clearly showing its Africoid elements. When we look at the lands called Sumer, Sumer being the founding civilization of what is thought of as Mesopotamia, and we look at the peoples of Sumer, we find again a clear Africoid look, a clear Africoid features about the way they look. Now, what is interesting about Sumer, or the Sumerians, call themselves the Blackheads, not black-haired, Blackheads. And their capital city of Sumer was Kish. Now, Kish, in the language of ancient Kemet or Egypt, was Kesh. Now, Kesh and Kish are what in the Bible became Cush, and that is a name for Ethiopia. This is consistent with the conclusions of several scholars of antiquity from the 19th century who said that the Sumerians were a branch of the Cushitic or Ethiopian race. And again, this is verified by the Sumerian language itself and also by archaeological and anthropological remains. We can go forward on our next slide and we can see other examples of what we can call Africoid types. For example, we can find in certain captives from Assyria. Now this is relatively late, 600 BC. These captives have clear Africoid features, particularly in their hairstyle. What is interesting is that these captives are Jewish captives of the Assyrians 600 BC. Now we will come to that a little bit later to explain the full significance of that. Additional slides show us, if we can have the next slide, that again, there are the gods and deities, particularly the goddesses of this region, show, again, Africoid characteristics, or an Africoid phenotype. The term phenotype means sum total of physical characteristics, so when we use the word phenotype, we mean what they look like. And again, Astarte, one of the primary and most important goddesses of the so-called Middle East, related to Isis, no doubt, again shows what you might describe as an Africoid phenotype. Additional slides that we have, and we can go on to the next slide, going further east into the lands today called Persia. We find walls, we find that in 1894, a French excavator by the name Julefoy excavated what he called the Acropolis of Susa. Susa was the capital city of Elam, and it has a history going back to about 3000 BC or 5,000 years ago. And we find figurines looking like this, with a obvious sphinx-like appearance, which derives from the Nile Valley. And above, there is a kind of a winged figure, which clearly owes its form to Nile Valley prototypes, or the prototypes of Nile Valley civilization. And the coloration and the complexion of the figures there definitely show the dark complexion of Africa. And if we can have the next slide. These are figures that are of soldiers who are called the 10,000 Immortals. They also come from Susa. They also are clearly black. They are the palace guard of the king of Elam from Susa. So that Susa was the capital of Elam, which was a black culture and civilization, which is the first civilization, by the way, of Persia. What we are doing is trying to show that what we call, the people that we call the Semites, when we go back to the dawn of history, the Semites don't look like many Semites do today. They don't look like Israelis or Syrians. They, as I say, are a mulatto people back then, when they are not completely and totally Africoid as we see here. That whole area of what we think of as the Middle East, or as Africa's Northeast extension, as I like to refer to it, as I say, had a different ethnic complexion than what we customarily think of. Now, having said that, we can go to the figure of Abraham. Abraham having left the Ur of the Chaldees. The Chaldeans, by the time they appear in history, are heavily Semiticized, that is, heavily mixed with Indo-European and African. So the complexion of Abraham is going to be distinctly darker than the way he is normally represented. The other thing that we can say about Abraham is that he begins a series of migrations that take him and his family to Kemet or Egypt. What is interesting is that a whole series of experience there really changed everything about him. Not the least of which he takes on an Egyptian wife, Hagar, and indeed, Hagar becomes the mother of his oldest son, who we know as Ishmael in history. Now, Hagar, of course, by this, particularly since this is Middle Kingdom times, 2,000 years before the time of Christ, this is clearly a deeply, purely, as pure can be, black African civilization. So Hagar is a black woman. Now, that means that Ishmael is at least 50% black and African. If we assume that Abraham himself has a strong African admixture, then the percentage of African genes, you might say, is even higher yet. But at the minimum, it's 50%. What is also interesting is that Ishmael himself marries a woman from his mother's people, marries a black Egyptian woman, and Ishmael is the founding ancestor of Arab peoples. So when we think about Arab peoples, their ancestors are minimally 75% black. And they come down from, and they derive their ancestry from the figure of Abraham. Now, Abraham has another son, his younger son, which is Isaac. And Isaac goes on to become the father of Jacob. Now, there's a lot that we could say about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that we are going, that we don't have time to develop further. But the thing we can say about Jacob concerns what happens to him as a consequence of the adventures or misadventures of his son Joseph. And this is where we might say we really get to the heart of the matter. Because after the story of Joseph and after Joseph's intervention, what do we find? We find 70 starving, illiterate shepherds from what is now Canaan migrating into the largest dominant civilization in the world at the time in Northeast Africa. So, if they are Canaanites or in some way mixed with Canaanites, again, there's already going to be an African element in their ethnicity already, but then they come into Northeast Africa and settle down for the next 430 years. Now, what happens to any people who come into a dominant culture, nation, or civilization? Within one generation, they have lost the language, whatever they brought in. Within that same generation, they have changed their culture. They have lost whatever distinctive culture they brought with them, and they become acculturated to the nation that they have migrated to. Well, what also tends to happen, and we see it here in the United States of America as we do elsewhere, is that they also lose their ethnicity. And it was particularly prominent with Abraham and his kin and his immediate descendants to take wives and spouses from among the people where they settled. Now, therefore, what does this lead us to? It leads us to the 430 years that the descendants of Jacob spent in Kemet, meaning literally the black land. They would have had to have taken their spouses from among the people whom they settled. So whatever their ethnicity may have been when they came in, when they left out, 430 years later, they had to have been black people. They would have had to have been linguistically, culturally, and ethnically Egyptians. That is, linguistically, ethnically, and culturally, people who belong to the world of black Africa. Now, this is maybe an ingenious argument, but it actually has some documentary evidence to support it. There are no fewer than 6 references in the classical literature from authorities as diverse as Tacitus, Celsus, Diodorus, and Strabo, and Plutarch, who insist that the group that left Kemet, and therefore Africa, with Moses, were a group of Ethiopians and Egyptians who, in a sense, rebelled against established authority and established religion, and were led out by a renegade priest that they named Osarsiph, which means son of Osiris. So the classical authorities themselves recognize that the original people who became the Hebrews of history, when they started their historical migrations that led them into the land later called Israel, they did so as black and African people out of Kemet or out of Egypt. Which brings us to the figure of Moses himself. What we know about Moses, aside from what we find in the Exodus story, comes from an essay by Josephus, who wrote Against Apion. In this essay, which was actually an apology and a defense of Jewish history, he nonetheless gives us one of the only surviving accounts of the Egyptian version of the story of Exodus. And what do the Egyptians say? The Egyptians say that Moses was originally an Egyptian priest named Osarsiph, or son of Osiris, who rebelled against the established religion of Ra and went in among a group of outcasts, 80,000 strong, and led them out of Egypt, and then taught them everything they knew, gave them a new religion.
Monotheism.
What is called monotheism, but even that is kind of a misnomer, because when you go right back to the very beginnings of the religious history of the Nile Valley, the idea of God as the one is always there. In fact, the creator is referred to as Wa, or the one. But then they had a multiplicity of other beings who carry out the will of the one. And so this is where this confusion between monotheism and polytheism comes out. Now, Akhenaten, living at the end of the 14th century, is the first and only of the pharaohs of the Nile Valley who insists that not only is God one, but there is no other being that should be represented except him. So this is not only monotheism, but monolatry. 100 years later, we have the whole drama that leads to the Exodus, and it was none other than Sigmund Freud himself who suggested that Osarsiph, who later changed his name to Moses, was you might say, a clandestine follower of the teachings of Akhenaten. So that the first creator of the what we call the monotheistic religions, in fact, you might say, therefore, the spiritual father of the three major monotheistic religions of the Western world, was indeed Akhenaten, Pharaoh of Egypt. So that again, we can begin to see a very powerful African imprint on Jewish history, or Hebrew history, and of course, Hebrew scripture. Now, it's important to make this distinction that while all Jews were Hebrews, not all Hebrews were Jews. Because the people we call Jews descend from the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. But there were 12 tribes of Israel. 10 of them form the northern kingdom that was dispersed in about 770 BC by the attack of Syria. They were Hebrews, yes, but they were not Jews. And in fact, when they came back, or they filtered back into the region about 100 to 200 years later, they became the Samaritans. So that's the reason why Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, let alone Moses, are not Jews. They're not even Hebrews. By definition, the only way you can be a Hebrew, let alone a Jew, is to have received the law. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not receive the law. That was only done under Moses. And it is Moses who introduced the name of the deity that they would henceforth follow. His name was to be Yahweh. By the way, there is ample evidence within the Bible itself that our monotheistic patriarchs before the time of Moses weren't always that monotheistic at all. Because in Genesis, what do we find? We find in the original accounts of Genesis, the Creator saying, "Let us make man in our own image." And we find later on that the sons of the gods come down and marry with the daughters of men. And we even find Jacob marrying Rachel and taking the gods of Rachel's house with him. So again, there is, shall we say, a polytheistic element in the Old Testament prior to Moses. And Moses, again, was an Egyptian priest, completely learned in all of the lore and wisdom of ancient Kemet, and therefore would have carried all 210 books of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or Coming Forth by Day, in his head when he went outwards, when he left and led these outcasts with him, because that's what the Egyptians thought of them as, outcasts. So again, as we say, our whole perception of the Bible and the relationship of the Nile Valley and Egypt and Africa to the Bible changes dramatically. Let us now consider the figure of Yahweh. We have a slide which shows you Osiris, particularly Osiris in his lunar aspect. Now, there were several gods whose image and symbol was the moon in ancient Kemet. They were all really aspects of a single deity. But the name of the moon god, or the god whose image was the moon in Kemet, was named Yah. Yahweh, 25 times in the Old Testament, is referred to simply as Yah. And in fact, it's exactly the same word. When you add way to it, way, W-E-H or W-A-H, in the language of ancient Kemet means to increase. It means to increase. So it is, Yahweh means Yah the increaser. Now this was a title of Osiris. So what apparently happened, now remember, Moses, as Osiris, was the son of Osiris. He even changed his name to Moses, which was not a Hebrew name then or now. It was Musa in ancient Egyptian and Hebrew. Musa, mu means water, and sa means to draw out of the water. Well, if you know anything about the Osirian drama, the one who is drawn out of the water in the Osirian drama is actually Horus. And Horus is the son of Osiris. So it all connects up. And Yahweh is actually, his prototype is actually Osiris. So those who worship Yahweh basically are worshiping a form of Osiris. And that is consistent because Moses, in his initial manifestation, was the son of Osiris. We can go on in this vein, but all that to say is that the impact of Africa generally, Kemet in particular, on the emerging Hebrew nation, religion, and culture was decisive and overwhelming. In fact, at the beginning, it is just a manifestation of the culture and religion and philosophy of the Nile Valley, of Africa, if you like. So therefore, it is not surprising that you find these Nile Valley and African elements in the Old Testament and in the Bible. It would be surprising if you did not. So we can, that in a sense can summarize, at least in an introductory fashion, what I might describe as the African and therefore Nilotic or Nile Valley impact and influence and source of Hebrew and Jewish tradition, culture, and religion. Now, let us now proceed to a consideration of Christianity. And in order to understand Christianity, we have to, as it were, mine the riches of the Osirian drama, in which there are four principal divine actors, you might say. And it is necessary to know a little bit about each one of them in order to grasp the significance of Osiris in the Osirian drama in the origin evolution of Christianity. Here we have on slides at least several different images of Osiris. There is one image of him there with the flail and the cross with his arms crossed. There are some other, let us look at the next image of Osiris. And in fact, in this image, it is a reflection of his title, Kemwer, the Great Black One. And you see the flail. The flail is an image of his, is a symbol of his position as a representative of the growing grain, because the flail was used to thresh grain. So it was, you might say, an agricultural or agrarian image, if you like. And again, his complexion marks him as the Great Black One. Now let us look at the next slide. Now this is important because Osiris had many manifestations and many attributes, symbolically and mythically. On the one hand, he was said to be the ancestral cosmic ruler of ancient Kemet, and his rule lasted 28 years. This is a reflection of Osiris's connection to the moon and all of the mythology connected with the moon that we referred to earlier, because the moon is said to have 28 mansions, because the moon goes through a cycle of 28 days. He was also, as you see in this slide, he was a god connected to the grain. The grain grew up out of the body of Osiris. So in a sense, Osiris was resurrected through the growth of the grain. Now, let us move back a little bit and talk a little bit about what happened to Osiris to give him these attributes. Osiris was king of Egypt, mythically and cosmically speaking, and he ruled with his sister Isis. But he went and gave civilization to the rest of the world, and while he was gone, Isis ruled in his stead. But when he came back, his jealous brother Set wanted to do away with him and take over his kingdom. He made a coffin for him and induced him to lay down the coffin, at which point he nailed the coffin shut and threw it in the Nile, and it then floated down the Nile to a swamp which was called Byblos, and then a tree grew up around the coffin of Osiris. Isis, as a consequence of this disaster, begins her weeping and grieving, but then looks for the body of Osiris. She goes searching for the body of Osiris, and there's some children who tell her where to find it. So she finds the body of Osiris in this tree that has grown around it, and then she gets the coffin, gets his body, but before she can do anything about it, Set finds the coffin again, and this time takes out the body and cuts it up into 14 pieces and distributes and throws it all over the landscape. Isis manages, after this new disaster, to collect all 14 pieces of Osiris back together again, put them, reconstitute them, revive them with her mystic powers, and conceive after death, and the fruits of this conception will be Horus. Now,
The Immaculate Conception.
The Immaculate Conception. This growth of grain is one image of Osiris in the process of resurrection. So he dies in order for the grain to grow. And at harvest, the grain is cut down, representing the death of Osiris, and then it regrows or is reborn in the spring. But what happens with grain? You make it into bread. And so when you eat the grain or the bread, you're eating the body of Osiris, the mystic body of Osiris. So Osiris is the bread of life. He is the mystic and sacred bread of life. When you eat the bread, you're eating the body of Osiris. Now, he is also, can I have the next slide, please? He is also said, according to the story associated with him, to be associated with grape and the growing of the grape. because he is the deity or the neter or the principle that is supposed to have presided over the cultivation of grapes and the making of wine. So therefore, the blood of the grape is the blood of Osiris. The transubstantiated blood of the grape, which is wine, is therefore the blood of Osiris. So you can begin to see that that there's a Eucharistic aspect to this, and that his body is the bread, and the bread is his body, and the wine is his blood. And so we see that these these ritualistic aspects of Osiris are early and old, and they eventually come down to us in Christianity. Can I have the next slide, please?
They're 5,000 years old.
Yes, at least that. Now, on this slide, who we see standing next to Osiris is his sister wife, Isis, his consort, and by the way, his resurrector. She also has many different aspects. She is also the female personification of the grain. She has a connection to the moon, and perhaps her connection to the moon is older than Osiris. She is also considered the queen of heaven because she is identified with the star Sirius. But above all, she is the virgin mother of Horus. And she is also related to Hathor, Het-Her, because Het-Her means the mansion or house of Horus. And sometimes Hathor, Het-Her, is called Mary, M-E-R-I, which means beloved. So even the name Mary comes from the antecedents of the Nile Valley. Can I have the next slide showing us Isis? This is Isis in her personification as the Madonna, or the original Madonna of the Nile Valley, the virgin mother of Horus. Next slide, please. This is Horus himself, the falcon god. The reason why he has a falcon head is that he is the golden falcon identified with the sun, S-U-N. He is both S-O-N of Osiris and Isis, and he is the morning sun, S-U-N. The golden falcon, because of his color, its ability to soar high up in the sky, and because of his keen eyesight, was an image of the sun, S-U-N, who had conquered the dragon of darkness. So, and he has a warrior aspect because, you see, he is going to avenge the murder of Osiris by his contest with Set. And he eventually conquers Set and overcomes him and takes his rightful place as the heir of Osiris. So Horus is the justified son of Isis and Osiris.
And the Redeemer.
The Redeemer, yes. Next slide, please. Now, what we see there, and this is important, Horus, in his capacity as the sonship, as the son, S-O-N, is Osiris resurrected. When Cyrus is resurrected, when Osiris is revived, he is revived as his son, S-O-N, Horus. So they are, in a sense, the same. They are, you might say, two persons in the same figure. Next slide, please. Now, with Isis, Osiris, and Horus, you have the prototype of the Holy Family. This is the original Holy Family. Now, as we already said, that Isis was also identified with Hathor, Het-Her. In the Gospels, there is at least one scene in when the Holy Spirit comes down on the head of the Gospels, in the form of a dove. Well, one of the manifestations of Hathor was as the dove. So in that sense, the Holy Spirit really is the Holy Mother. And so we have, if you will, a naturalistic Holy Family that goes back into ancient times in Kemet. Next slide, please. This is Set. Set is the great adversary. He is the source of all disorder, all destruction, and death. He kills Osiris, although Osiris is resurrected, and he wars against his son Horus, although eventually he is conquered. But he is very interesting because, you see, Set is a prototype. When you add A-N to his name, it means the second, or the redoubling, or the duplication.
Satan.
So Satan is the second Set. Set's color is red, which has an evil connotation. Sometimes he is represented as a goat and therefore has cloven hooves. So when you talk about red color, cloven hooves, you can see that even our iconography that we associate with the anthropomorphic devil, Satan, actually also comes from Set, and therefore comes from the Nile Valley. And he is the fourth actor, as it were, in this Osirian drama. He's absolutely necessary. You can't have the drama without him because he is the principle of disorganization, of destruction that precedes recreation. Death and life are twin in this sense, and death begets life. What we see here on this slide here is a panel from the Temple of Luxor going back 1700 BC. It is describing the birth of a pharaoh. Now, the pharaoh is the earthly personification of Horus, so it is a divine birth. The mother, she is called Mut-Emwa, mother of the one. And you see in the left-hand panel, she is pregnant, and Thoth is coming to her to announce the birth of this son who has been conceived by Amun. Thoth is the messenger god, so he is a messenger announcing the birth of this divine son of Amun. On the second panel, you see her in the process of giving birth. She has Isis or Hathor in front of her, and she has Kneph in back of her. Kneph represents the divine breath, so he represents the Holy Spirit giving life to the mother of the god, so she is conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. On the next panel, on the upper right-hand corner, is the actual divine birth. And down below, and I think, and on the bottom panel, there are three divine personages that come and bringing gifts to the child and adoring the child. So here, 1700 BC, that is 1,700 years before the time of Jesus, on a panel in the Temple of Luxor, you have the Annunciation, Immaculate Conception, birth and adoration of the child. So here is the ancient Nile Valley representation of the nativity scene. Can I have the next slide, please? Now let us spend some time talking about this phenomenon here. This represents what we call the precession of the equinoxes. The earth spins on its axis like a top, but it does not spin in a vertical spin because of the gravitational pull of the sun and moon. Therefore, the axis is tilted 23.5 degrees from vertical. So while it's spinning, that tilt makes it wobble, and it wobbles around the vertical North Pole. So there are two North Poles. There's the celestial North Pole, which is tilted, and then there's the vertical North Pole called the North Pole of the ecliptic. And the celestial or tilted North Pole takes 26,000 years to revolve around the North Pole of the ecliptic or the vertical North Pole. Now, this phenomenon of 26,000 years of the precessional cycle, that's what it's called, this phenomenon was discovered perhaps as far back as 40 to 50,000 years ago. What they did at a time unknown in history is actually divide that arc into 12. Actually they created two cycles. One around the equator, really in between the tropics, which was the conventional zodiac of 12 arcs, each arc 2,160 years long, and also one around the North Pole. But let's focus on the one around the equator. Each 12 arcs, 12 arcs into 26,000 years gives you 2,160 years. In each one of these arcs, they identified a constellation, gave it a name, a symbol, and a history. Now, if you stand at the first day of spring and at sunrise and watch whatever constellation is on the eastern horizon at just before sunrise, that will be the constellation that dominates that 2,160-year arc. But if you can stand there for 2,160 years, you will find that constellation will slowly move so that it doesn't rise anymore, and another constellation comes to take its place. If you stand there 26,000 years, that same constellation that you originally observed will be back in its place. 12 different constellations will do that before you come back to your original ones. So each one, that takes 2,160 years for each constellation. That constitutes an age, and each constellation and its name, its symbol, and its history, and its spirit dominates the age. Now, we see this in the Temple of Dendera. The Temple of Dendera has a circular zodiac, and this is a representation of that zodiac in the temple of Denera. Zodiac comes from the Greek word zoion, which means animal, because most of the constellations are giving animal names and types. Now, why is this significant? Well, let us go back merely to about 42 to 4300 BC. At 42 to 4300 BC, the constellation that dominated the eastern horizon at spring, and can I have the next slide, please? Can I have the next slide, please? Was the bull, or Taurus. And by the way, that is also the ascension of Osiris. That's when Osiris becomes most prominent in Egyptian history, because Osiris is identified with the bull. So bull symbolism dominates that age for 2,160 years.
Taurus.
Taurus the bull. And you see it all over the world. Now, next slide, please. About 2200 BC, that is 2,160 years later, Taurus slips below the horizon at springtime, and the next constellation is that of Aries the Ram. Aries the Ram dominates the age for the next 2,160 years. This is the time when Hebrewism or Judaism comes to the fore. And this is the reason why the Old Testament is dominated by lamb and ram symbolism. Abel sacrifices a lamb. Isaac is saved by the sacrifice of a lamb. It is the blood of the lamb that saves the children of Israel. Joshua uses ram's horns to bring down the walls of Jericho. So we see that lamb and ram symbolism dominate this age. And indeed, the whole episode of Mount Sinai shows the conflict between the ages, because the Taurus age, or the bull age, has disappeared, and the ram age has come to the fore. But Aaron is a priest of the, no, I want you to go back, excuse me. Aaron is actually a priest of the age of the bull, which is the reason why he creates the golden calf. Because remember, the children of Israel wanted, they wanted security. They were beginning to get very nervous about being out there on their own. And so he creates this golden lamb for them. In fact, Aaron's name is Aaron. Means means bull, and Ren means calf. Bull calf. Aaron is a personification of the bull calf, or is a priest of the bull calf. And see, what Moses did, therefore, when he destroyed the golden calf at Sinai, was he was saying, in effect, he was saying, that age is past. It is now a new age. And who saved the children of Israel? The blood of the lamb, or the ram. To about 68 BC, there is another change. Next slide, please. This time it's the age of the fishes, the two fishes. This is the age of Pisces. And the savior of the age of Pisces is therefore, you might say, represented by the two fishes, or by the fish. But he is also called the Good Shepherd. Why? Because the symbolism from the previous age of Aries the Ram holds over. And he's also referred to as lamb. But the dominant symbols are the fish, because fish symbolism dominates the New Testament or Christianity. Now, this is because this is the age of Pisces. Jesus himself confirms this. How does he confirm this? The Pharisees says, prove to us, in effect what they say is, prove to us that you're the Messiah. He says, this is a wicked generation. It demands of me a sign. And the only sign I will give it is the sign of Jonah. Jonah is a fish man. So here we have Jesus telling everybody that he is the Messiah of the fish age. And the fish is the dominant symbol and the dominant spirit of his age. In fact, Jesus says that his ministry is celestial, because he says the sun, the celestial powers, he says there will be changes in the sun, moon, and the stars, and the celestial powers will be shaken. And that's a reference to that. And here on this next slide, we see from, again, the ancient book of the coming forth by day, the four fishers of Horus. Just like Jesus said, come to the four apostles, I will make you fishers of men. So you can begin to see how this iconography, this symbolism, is taken almost bodily from the ancient Nile Valley sources and brought forward into Christianity. Now, let's look at this in a different way. It is simply this. The birthday of Jesus is December 25th. It is also the birthday of Horus, or it was, and the birthday of every last sun, S-U-N, deity of antiquity. Why? Horus is identified with the rising sun, or the newborn sun.
Winter solstice.
Winter solstice. The winter solstice starts on December 22nd. That is the time when the sun is lowest on the horizon. And so therefore, the sun is at its lowest ebb. It stays in that air. It's the shortest day of the year. It stays at its lowest ebb for 3 consecutive days. Then, right after midnight, on December 25th, it begins its rise on the ecliptic. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, if you stand and watch the sun at noon, on the shortest day of the year, it'll be very close to the horizon. If you watch it for the next 6 months, by June 22nd, it'll be right overhead. So the sun itself has climbed the horizon, or climbed the ecliptic on a path. Well, therefore, the sun on December 25th has begun its ecliptic ascent. Metaphorically, we can say the sun has been born. Back about 2,000 years ago, as this was happening on December 25th, Virgo, the constellation Virgo, was on the eastern horizon. So the sun, at that time, was born on December 25th of a virgin. On the western horizon was Taurus. And Taurus has within it the constellation of Auriga, or it has the star group Auriga, which is the stables. So he was born in a manger in a stable of a virgin. So this is celestial. So his birth is also a celestial event. Now, what happens is that at noon, for 3 months, the sun rises on the horizon. After 3 months, it gets to the place where it is now ready to cross the celestial equator. The celestial equator is the earthly equator projected into space. Well, it gets to that around March 21st, and then it sits on the celestial equator for apparently 3 days. So in a sense, the sun is being crucified on the celestial equator on March 21st at the beginning of spring, and then after that, as it continues on its path, days start to become longer, so the sun can be said to be reborn or born a second time.
Spring equinox.
This happens at the spring equinox. It is also the time when the sun does what? It passes over the celestial equator. So the Passover and the crucifixion of the sun are the two things that happen right at the spring equinox. Our own Easter is a sun and moon festival.
It's true.
It happens the first Sunday after the first full moon after Easter because of this. Now, some of the Eastern symbols therefore become intelligible. When the Easter chick is none other than the Bennu bird, because one of the images of Osiris and Horus is the Bennu bird, the bird of resurrection, and it comes up out of the egg of the sun. So the golden egg, let me backtrack. Children are the ones who participate in the Easter egg hunt. Why? Because what I said earlier in this discussion is that when Isis was looking for the body of Osiris, it was children who showed her where to find it. So it is children who participate in the Easter egg hunt. And the golden egg is the son of Easter, the reborn son, S-U-N, of Easter, or the Bennu bird, who, when it comes out of the egg, comes out as a chick. Sometimes it's a hawk, but also it comes out as a chick. Or the silver egg, which is the moon, because the moon also determines Easter. Now, this moon symbolism is very important because this resurrection symbolism is also related to Osiris, because Osiris's main attribute is that he is the one who has been reborn or resurrected and becomes a hope of rebirth and resurrection for all humankind. There are other images of Osiris. One is the rabbit or the hare. Why? Because the rabbit or hare jumps up, leaps up,
and it's a symbol of Osiris rising. And in fact, the word un, or when, means good, and it is shown hieroglyphically by a rabbit. And Osiris is called Un or Wen-Efer, the good being, and it is represented by a rabbit or hare. So what does this mean? It means that the Easter bunny is none other than Osiris.
Right.
So all these symbols, the Easter chick, the Easter bunny, the Easter egg hunt, even hot cross buns, represent this crossification that occurs at the equinox,
Spring.
as the second birth. Now, let's look at some other aspects of Christianity. We can look at the figure of Lazarus. There's two different Lazaruses, but I'm interested in the Lazarus who was raised from the dead, because you can break his name down. Well, let's talk about the story of Lazarus. He apparently dies. He has two sisters, Martha and Mary. They come to Jesus and ask him to come minister to their brother Osiris. And he says, I am the light, I am the resurrection, I am the life. He comes to the door of Lazarus and says, Lazarus, rise and come forth. And Lazarus arises apparently from the dead. Well, let's again go back to ancient Nile Valley sources. Osiris, the dead Osiris, has two sisters, Nephthys and Isis. In this case, however, the one who tells him to rise and come forth, next slide, please. Let's see the next slide. And here we see Isis on the right and Nephthys on the left, mourning their dead brother Osiris, weeping and wailing over their dead brother Osiris in the fashion of Martha and Mary. Then, next slide, please. Osiris, next slide. It is Horus, in this instance, who tells Osiris to rise and come forth. Now, if you break down the name of Lazarus, it is El, and then the middle part of the name, Azar, and then Us. Now, in the ancient Egyptian language, Osiris was Asar, or Woser. So, Lazarus means the Osiris. So again, we find that this whole process of resurrection that is created in this story in the Gospel of Lazarus actually is is taken bodily again from the resurrectional drama of the so-called Book of the Coming Forth by Day. Can I have the next slide, please?
The name, by the way, is Heretic Egyptian.
I'm sorry?
H-I-E-R, Heretic Egyptian.
Heretic, yes. What I'm going to do, let's pass on. Let's pass on the next slide because now, I want to make another point here. The term Christ comes from the Greek Christos. The term Christos in Greek originally comes from Alexandria, and it was first used about 290 BC. Clearly, therefore, it comes from some other source in Greek, because you don't see it in Greek until you see it in Alexandria, that is in Africa, 290 BC. Well, what does Christos mean in afterwards Christ? It means the anointed or to anoint. Let us look at Osiris. Osiris is represented in mummified form. In his mummified form, he is set up on his feet as a symbol of resurrection. But how do you mummify anybody in ancient Egypt? You anoint them with oils and rosins and spices. There is also another name for Osiris in his mummified and therefore resurrected form. It is Keres or Kerest, which in Greek became Christos. Now, when Jesus is taken down from the cross, Joseph of Arimathea takes him to his house, washes his body, anoints him in rosin and oils, and then wraps him up in linen bandages. In other words, he mummifies him. This is in the Gospel according to Luke. So therefore, the Christ is the anointed, resurrected one, whose prototype is already Osiris. Jesus becomes the Christ by virtue of his crucifixion on the cross, because the cross represents the unity of human and divine. It is what brings human and divine together, is in the figure of the cross. And in the process of mummifying and anointing him, of turning him into the Christos, Christ, he then becomes man and God, just as Osiris is. Next slide, please. Now, in the 1st century BC, Christianity becomes formalized and organized mostly, almost entirely in Egypt. Even though Jesus was, yes, a Jew, he spent a good period of his life in Africa, in Northeast Africa. He was, according to historical sources, associated with a Pythagorean Jewish sect called the Essenes. And when we say Pythagorean, that in effect means the Egyptian temples, because Pythagoras was trained for 22 years in the Egyptian temples. In fact, historically, he is called, by the historical testimony of the Talmud and the Mishnah, he is called Yeshu ben Pandera, or Jesus ben Pandera, Jesus son of the panther. Pandera means panther. Now, in the Egyptian temples, the priests were always distinguished by panther skins. So, in a sense, his very name is connecting him with the ancient Egyptian temples. That is, Joshua ben Pandera.
1 minute.
But in the first 300 to 500 years after AD, he is never represented in his human form, only as the lamb, the crucified lamb. When he is finally shown as a human being, this is the first image that we have of him, Jesus as a human being in the iconography.